WVW Broadcast Network and The New American are pleased to present The New American TV with your host, Rebecca Terrell. This broadcast is committed to helping you understand the truth behind the news. And now, here's your host, Rebecca Terrell.
Welcome to The New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. Today is Monday, February 27th, and here are some of the headlines we're following. China is considering sending lethal aid to Russia in its war with Ukraine. This, according to CIA Director William Burns on Sunday's Face the Nation.
Well, we're confident that the Chinese leadership is considering the provision of lethal equipment. We also don't see that a final decision has been made yet, and we don't see evidence of actual shipments of lethal equipment. And that's why I think Secretary Blinken and the President have thought it important to make very clear what the consequences of that would be as well.
To deter it.
Yeah, to deter it, because it would be a very risky and unwise bet.
His remarks come 1 week after Secretary of State Anthony Blinken made the same claim on Meet the Press. Yet despite Burns' assertion that the White House wants to make clear the consequences of such action, Blinken remained vague in reference to a recent conversation with senior Chinese diplomat Wang Yi.
What kind of consequences are you talking about? What did you share with him?
Look, I'm not going to get into that, but I can again tell you that this is something that President Biden has raised directly with President Xi.
Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin shot back at a press conference the next day, accusing the U.S. of pouring weapons into the battlefield, fanning the flames and stoking confrontation, deflecting blame and spreading disinformation. Norfolk Southern Railway has resumed shipping contaminated waste from East Palestine, Ohio, the site of a catastrophic train derailment earlier this month. The accident released hazardous chemicals into the town's soil and groundwater. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency had ordered the company to pause shipments of those chemicals from the site in order to identify appropriate disposal locations, which include underground injection wells for liquid waste and solid waste incinerators. Chemicals from the accident contaminated area soil and groundwater. Federal and state officials have repeatedly said it is safe for evacuees to return to the area. Residents say differently, as we learned from a Saturday press briefing. Listen to the question one reporter asked CDC Associate Director Jill Schuttgart.
We're hearing the air quality is safe. We're hearing the water quality is safe, but people are still getting sick. Obviously, there's some people who are having chemical bronchitis. There's animals who are getting sick. Can you explain why people may be getting sick, but these quality and readings are showing safe levels?
So we do we do understand that there were a lot of hazardous materials that were spilled at the incident. However, we really need to look a little bit more at the data.
The nonprofit Project Veritas usually makes headlines with its guerrilla tactics and investigative journalism, but last week it earned the spotlight when its board of directors ousted James O'Keefe, who founded the organization in 2014. Now, staff members have released a video saying they stand by their founder and want him back. They blame high-level disputes between the board and O'Keefe and say the latter has not resigned or been fired. That is despite the fact that last week O'Keefe broadcast a video saying he had no job at Project Veritas. The board released a statement the same day accusing O'Keefe of financial malfeasance. However, staff video promises supporters that Project Veritas will continue to carry out their important work of exposing corruption for as long as they are able.
No board or donor ever tells us what to report, and they never will.
We will never replace James O'Keefe. But for now, we see it as our job to hold the torch for him while keeping the door wide open for his return. We will keep the spirit of James's mission alive for as long as we are able. We have investigations underway and stories to release. Our reporters are in the field.
The same day this video was released, last Friday, 14 Project Veritas whistleblowers appeared in their own I Stand with James O'Keefe broadcast. Here's a portion.
I'm the CBS Detroit whistleblower with Project Veritas, and I stand with James O'Keefe.
I'm the CNN whistleblower for Project Veritas, and I stand with James O'Keefe.
HHS vaccine nurse whistleblower with Project Veritas, and I stand with James O'Keefe.
I'm the Department of Homeland Security whistleblower from Project Veritas, and I stand with James O'Keefe.
O'Keefe openly wondered about the timing of the board's action against him and the blockbuster story that Project Veritas recently released. That had to do with a Pfizer executive making claims that the company has explored mutating the SARS-CoV-2 virus so it could continue profiting off of vaccines.
The only thing that has changed is that we broke the biggest story in our organization's history. You know that one I'm talking about? Pfizer. The last week of January, with 50 million views. That broke the record by 10x. Our video became a global phenomenon. It was about Pfizer and one of the directors discussing mutating the virus. Our confrontation video, where he locked me in a pizza restaurant with you and you, and he smashed the equipment and called the police, that became a phenomenon and was riveting television for our audiences glued to their screens.
Joining me to discuss these developments is the New American commentator Daniel Natal. Daniel, welcome to the program. And do you see a common theme running through these stories?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the last one, you keep hearing it's not quite clear what's happening right now, and you hear scuttlebutt, and that's all that we have to rely on right now. And people weren't heartened by the fact that one of the chief people trying to oust O'Keefe was a guy named Benjamin Hinckley. And if you go to his website, he has his he/him pronouns listed. So he may be a little kind of culturally out of sync with O'Keefe. And so there's a lot of talk right now about, O'Keefe seems to be suggesting that Pfizer is kind of influencing what's happening, and they're kind of sabotaging him. And it would suggest that O'Keefe has been surrounded by a bunch of kind of Mike Pence types who are seen as an insurance policy, that if the founder steps out of line, they can kind of decapitate him and replace him with a suitably compromised individual. And Benjamin Hinckley's one of those. And there's a lot of people as well talking about the DeSantis camp trying to decapitate all the people who were pro-Trump in anticipation of the upcoming election. So it's very murky what's happening right now.
Right, and it doesn't seem like we're getting the straight story on China and Ukraine and Ohio either. So and moving right along in our headlines, Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman famously had a near fatal stroke months before his election. A few weeks ago, he went to the hospital claiming that he was feeling lightheaded. And then, according to NBC News, he checked himself into Walter Reed Medical Center.
I just got handed this statement from John Fetterman's office. Obviously, he is the senator from Pennsylvania. He said he has checked himself into Walter Reed National Medical Center. What more do we know?
Yeah, this is just really coming out in the last few minutes. This is obviously really sad. It says here in this statement from Fetterman's chief of staff that he checked himself into Walter Reed Medical Hospital to receive treatment for clinical depression. They said he visited with the Capitol attending physician Brian Monahan here early in the week on Monday, who advised him to do this, advised him to check himself into the hospital. They said that he will continue getting voluntary treatment on a voluntary basis. And after examining John, the doctors at Walter Reed told us that John is getting the care he needs and will soon be back to normal. Of course, it's been a rough start for this senator who just came off a very heated victory in Pennsylvania. Just a week ago, he was in the hospital after not feeling well, feeling lightheaded after the Democratic retreat last Wednesday. Fortunately, no signs of further stroke symptoms. Of course, he experienced a near-death experience by having a severe stroke just months ahead of the election in November. So this has been a really rough start for this senator, and we've seen him in the halls yesterday. I actually noticed that he missed the vote at night, and I wondered why that was. Now we know it's because of this, but this is somebody who we've seen in the halls. Obviously, he's still suffering from some auditory process issues coming off of that stroke he suffered. There's accommodations coming into play here, both in committee rooms and on the floor, but clearly someone now who's getting the care that he needs after disclosing this diagnosis that many Americans unfortunately suffer with.
So that is the mainstream narrative, but John Cardillo, host of the nationally syndicated John Cardillo Show, tweeted out something unusual, being told that Fetterman is essentially brain dead, and it's being hidden because keeping him in office until August 18th avoids a special election, which Republicans would most certainly win. This must be investigated. Irrespective of what may be idle rumors, Senator Fetterman's wife, Giselle, and their children have fled to Canada for some undisclosed reason. She posted on social media, "We drove straight into Canada. We talked about lots of hard things and how we will all have to face hard things, about the need to be gentle with all and with ourselves. We did some scary things, but we did them together. We ziplined over Niagara Falls, and August got stuck. We talked about flexibility and the need to always have an open heart and an open mind." Senator Fetterman's controversial spouse, who drew criticism for being in the United States illegally for 15 years before their marriage, has now evidently hopped over another border to zipline. Needless to say, the woman, once compared to Lady Macbeth for the control she exerted over her mentally compromised husband, is now drawing additional criticism for her choice of activities as he suffers in the hospital. Speaking of drawing criticism, Woody Harrelson has become a lightning rod for the left as he lampooned the pandemic, calling pharmaceutical companies the biggest drug cartels in the world on Saturday Night Live.
Okay, so the movie goes like this. The biggest drug cartels in the world get together and buy up all the media and all the politicians and force all the people in the world to stay locked in their homes, and people can only come out if they take the cartel's drugs and keep taking them over and over. I threw the script away. I mean, who is going to believe that crazy idea?
Elon Musk tweeted his approval of Harrelson's comments. Others were not as supportive. Variety reported that Woody Harrelson is under fire for referencing his controversial stance on vaccination and the COVID-19 pandemic in his opening monologue on SNL. Vanity Fair piled on, writing that Woody Harrelson really blew it on SNL. The Emmy winner launched his 5th hosting gig with a rambling, nonsensical monologue, and the show never recovered. Many other mainstream outlets went into similar apoplexy over the actor's comments. The greatest fear that the pharmaceutical-funded media had was that Mr. Harrelson's observations might go viral. Meanwhile, the U.S. Energy Department thinks that an accidental lab leak likely caused the COVID pandemic. The Wall Street Journal reported on this Energy Department change of mind, attributing it to a recently released classified intelligence report. It's the same conclusion that the FBI reached in 2021, but the CIA is still undecided. All of the agencies agree that COVID was not the result of a Chinese bioweapons program. Daniel, what say you?
Yeah, you asked earlier if there was a common theme among all of these stories. One would say, look, the Woody Harrelson one has a common theme with the previous Project Veritas one and being shut down once they go after the world's largest drug cartels. But I was tracking a story. There's an interesting story I'd like to talk about just really quickly. And it says James Bond books edited to remove racist references. And this comes hard on the heels of Willy Wonka. When they started changing Willy Wonka, editing it, censoring it, they made Augustus Gloop not fat anymore. And what jumped out at me is they're trying to remove the vice from the consequences of vice, right? They're trying to tell you that whether you're virtuous or whether you're vicious, that it'll arrive at the same location. And this is the common theme of all of these stories. Like, look at the very top of the show, you mentioned the East Palestine. And there's clearly consequences to chemical spills. And they're saying, no, there's no consequences to chemical spills or with the COVID thing. People, are suffering problems related to the therapeutics. And they're like, oh, there's no problems at all related, so they're decoupling the cause from the effect. And that seems to be the common theme across all of this, but Bill Gates had this book called How to Lie Through Statistics, right? And the lady said when she was faced with with all these people getting ill after the chemical spill, the vinyl chloride, she was like, okay, don't trust your lying eyes, don't trust the environment around you, don't trust the people who are getting sick. Let's go for the data. Let's see what the data says. And of course they can rig, the tests to, give them any result that they want. And so that seems to be the common theme among all these stories, is the decoupling of cause from effect. So
right, denying reality, but also not giving us the full story. So it's kind of the age-old theme of media.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't trust them. You have to be your own journalist here. So thank God for Twitter, right? All right. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for your time and for your insights here. We are about out of time, and we will see everybody back on the other side of this break.
The John Birch Society has been working tirelessly since 1958 to preserve freedom safeguard the Constitution, and restore our God-given rights. We continually educate voters and lead the freedom movement. Join us as we work against a tyrannical one-world government. United as one, we can defeat this conspiracy against a free America. JBS founder Robert Welch said, "Education is our total strategy and truth our only weapon." Join us in restoring this great nation.
Imprisonment, forced labor, permanent separation from my family, perhaps death. I knew what could happen to people who were caught trying to defect, but the watchtowers stood yards away. The possibility of a new life in a different world, one without tyranny, was within sight. The West. I thought of the rewards no longer crushed under the boot of communism. I would work and make money, no longer restrained by the chains of collectivism. I would say what I wanted, without fear of spies and informants nearby. I would be free. The frozen rain and Romanian mud sipped through my gloves and cloths. I fantasized about the fire burning in the wood stove of my parents' home, but I pushed those thoughts from my mind, closed my eyes, and waited for the cover of the darkness.
Get Defector, a true story of tyranny, liberty, and purpose by Mark Hobafkovich with Paul Dragu, a thrilling page-turner that will remind you how precious yet vulnerable freedom is. Available at shopjbs.org or Amazon. For a limited time, get 20% off your entire order using promo code Defector20 when you purchase Defector at shopjbs.org.
Welcome back to the New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. Though carbon dioxide is essential to life on Earth, it is demonized by leftists who are determined to use it as an excuse to rob us of our freedoms. The Biden administration especially has dedicated itself to phasing out cars powered by internal combustion engines and replacing them with electric vehicles. Recently, the New American senior editor Veronica Kirilenko sat down with automotive journalist Eric Peters to discuss the insanity of these proposals. Let's take a look.
So, Eric, what are your thoughts on electric cars' potential to save the planet?
Where do we start? I like what you said about carbon dioxide not being a pollutant. Let's start there. There was a really shady, dishonest, disingenuous shifting of definitions. And we've had to deal with a lot of that lately with regard to what was formerly and historically understood to be a pollutant in the context of automotive vehicle emissions. And what it meant were compounds like particulates and unburned hydrocarbons, things like that, that could cause smog, air pollution, respiratory issues in people. And when that term was used, that's what people were given to understand was being talked about. Carbon dioxide, whatever your position on climate change, is an inert gas that has nothing to do at all with air pollution, smog, respiratory issues. But they have managed to pull off this shuck and jive, this equation of this inert gas with the things that people have understood with reason, because it's true, are harmful to human health. And they've done that. That alone says to me that their motives are not genuine, that they're not honest people. They're not telling people, okay, this is a category of exhaust byproduct, and this is another category. And it does this and that does that. And the two are not the same, and we can have that discussion. Instead, they're trying to conflate the two things together in order to manipulate people.
To what ends?
Well, for the purpose of creating this supposed existential crisis that justifies getting rid of combustion-powered vehicles in favor of electric vehicles. That's the dynamic that they're trying to set up. They're saying it's not that electric cars are a superior product, which they're not by any objective metric. They cost more. They don't travel as far. They take much longer to recharge, to instill energy in order to be able to use them again. They don't last as long. You can go on and on and on with all of the cons of the electric car, which, as you and I talked about a little bit off the air, are not being told to people. Instead, they're being told all of the pros. Oh, it's a very quick thing and it's very quiet, all of which is true. but it's unfortunate they're not telling people the full story, and so people are being misled.
No,
At any-
let's go into more details, because you recently posted an article about very serious issues with electric cars that most potential buyers might not even be aware of. So please tell us about these under-publicized problems. And
Well,
you mentioned about that they don't go very far. What else?
Well, let's start with something that's kind of a riff on the old phrase. You've probably heard it. Your mileage may vary. You know, before there were electric cars, you'd heard that phrase. Well, with electric cars, it can really vary. And a lot of people found out about that during the cold snap that we had in December, including myself. It just happened, and it was very convenient, and it was very fortuitous that I got a number of electric cars to test drive. I write new car reviews, among other things that I do. And so I had a Ford F-150 Lightning, and then I had a Ford Mach-E, and then I had a Mercedes EQS, all electric, during a period when the air temperature didn't get much out of the low teens and sometimes went down below that. And in cold weather, battery performance is less. It's why if you live in the Midwest, in the cold areas of the country, people will plug in their cars overnight because the battery's performance, its ability to start the combustion engine the next day, will be less. And you might not be able to get it started if you haven't plugged it in overnight. Well, it's similar with EVs. You substantially lose power from the battery, and so your range diminishes, and it can diminish markedly from what's advertised. So if they tell you that the vehicle will go, let's say, 270 miles in the case of the Mach-E Mustang, and you find out that, in fact, on a full charge, it will really only go 190 miles, it's a problem. And it's a problem that's magnified by the fact that, unlike a conventional car with a combustion engine, where even if you run it down on fumes, hey, there's a gas station up ahead, I'll just, I'll roll in there and I'll fill up and I'll be able to get to work on time. If you somehow have forgotten to do that with your electric car, or if you didn't anticipate that the range was going to go down as much as it did, and you don't have the time, and if you can't find a place to charge, well, you're in a pickle, you're stuck, you're not going to be able to go where you need to go. And I found out that you end up having to almost plan your entire day around this endless ritual of plugging in, plugging out, worrying about the range, thinking how far you've got to go, and will I be able to make it? And it gets very old very fast.
How is that?
Well, in
the battery does.
What I meant was, it's a vernacular. It's an English expression meaning it's a hassle. We have gotten so used to taking things for granted. And one of the things that we take for granted is being able to just, on the spur of the moment, without any thought, hey, I feel like going out to get some food. I feel like driving wherever. So you just jump in your car and you go. And it doesn't matter that you didn't think to gas up the car the evening before, because you can just gas up at the gas station that's down the road and go. You cannot do that with an electric car. If you get home and you have almost no range because you've depleted the charge of the battery, well, you're going to sit and wait for at least several hours while the thing charges before you can get going again. Now, what if something comes up? What if your kid is sick? What if you have to go somewhere right now? You can't. So, that convenience is being taken away from people for the sake of this boogeyman idea that there's an existential crisis from carbon dioxide emissions.
Yeah, and there is another very important aspect. Interestingly, it is known for a fact that the engines of the EVs require a list of certain minerals such as graphite, nickel, lithium, to name a few, which mining is associated with significant environmental impacts, which seems to defeat the purpose of the green auto fleet. What's your comment on that?
Of course, and it's in fact an environmental train wreck. The typical EV, which is a small car like the Tesla Model 3, which is about the size of a Honda Civic sedan, a small car. It has 1,000-pound battery pack, 1,000 pounds. And in that battery is an enormous quantity of lithium and cobalt and graphite. And these materials are rather difficult to extract and manufacture and refine and put into the finished form. In the case of lithium, you have to leach it using leach fields that consume a tremendous amount of water, that once it's been used for this purpose, the water is poison. And you got to figure out, what are you going to do with all this wastewater? Nobody seems to care about that. You can go online and look up lithium leach fields, and you will see something that looks like, Chernobyl, except, spread out over 100 acres of land. And nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody also wants to talk about the fact that the majority of the electricity that is generated in this country is generated by burning hydrocarbon fuels, whether it's coal, natural gas, or oil. So as Rush Limbaugh once said, electric cars are not zero emissions vehicles, they're elsewhere emissions vehicles. If you really do believe that carbon dioxide is a pollutant, what does it matter whether the pollution is coming out of the tailpipe or coming out of the smokestack of a big factory? And that leads me into another thing, which is that these EVs generally are energy hogs. You know, we hear all the time about gas hogs, you know, cars that use a lot of gas in order to deliver a lot of performance. For example, you can get a new Dodge Charger Hellcat with a supercharged engine and it has 700 horsepower, really fast, and it gets like 12 miles per gallon. Well, the equivalent of that is a Tesla Model S. You know, it has this incredibly large battery that requires an incredible amount of electrical power in order to deliver what Elon Musk calls ludicrous speed. Energy is energy. It takes a certain amount of energy to propel a vehicle from 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds or whatever it is. So they're using far more electricity than is necessary. You know, again, we're talking about there's an existential crisis. The climate is changing. So how in the world can they justify this gratuitous, wasteful use of energy for the sake of driving a car 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds? I love fast cars. I have fast cars. But the whole point of it is, you know, if there's an existential crisis because people are consuming too much energy, then why are we touting these high performance energy hog electric cars?
And how do you answer this question?
Well, why? Because again, it's a way for people who want to preen green without actually suffering any consequences. The majority of people who buy these electric cars are almost by default very affluent people. You know, Ford right now has had to shut down production of the Lightning pickup truck for some unspecified issue with the battery. But the deeper issue is that the price of the thing has risen 3 times over the last 12 months, and it's now almost $60,000 for the base truck. You know, by the time you put in the higher range battery, it's a $75,000 truck. Who can afford a $75,000 truck? Who can afford a $50,000 vehicle? Most people don't have the money to afford these vehicles, and that's why the majority of the electric cars that are being bought are being purchased in very affluent parts of the country, like San Francisco, Washington, D.C., places like that, where you've got these very affluent people on the left who want to show everybody how concerned they are about the climate, you know, but they don't want to drive around in a little putt-putt car, you know, that goes 0 to 60 in 12 seconds and only has a top speed, you know, 75 miles an hour, which is, hey, that's all you need to get from A to B. But they don't like that. They, you know, they want to have their high performance and at the same time virtue signal to everybody else how much they care about the climate.
All right. But there is another important point that I'd like to mention. Not only is mining environmentally irresponsible, but human rights are often abused. For example, it's been widely reported on the child labor employed in African countries that mine minerals for EVs and smartphones, etc. How do you see it coexisting with the leftist woke ideology?
Well, if the left can be defined by anything, it's cognitive dissonance. You know, they don't seem to hew to any particular principle. They'll show outrage about A, but they will praise B, even though the two things are identical. So they're filled with all sorts of outrage about the horrible things that were done to slaves 150 years ago in America. But they don't seem to care at all about the living, breathing people, who most of whom happen to be Black in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who are clawing out the cobalt for their electric cars out of open pit mines. So, you know, it's not that they're moral, it's that they're hypocritical.
Very much so. And I'd like to ask you about the safety of the EVs. I found very contradictory reports about the EV safety. Some say they're much safer than conventional cars, while others point out the risk of a car catching fire, which is then hard to extinguish. What can you say about that?
Well, actually, there's two things, one of which has not been covered very much, and it goes back to, remember high school physics when we learned about M equals FA, mass equals force times acceleration? Well, electric cars are heavy. They're very heavy. The Ford F-150, which is a half-ton truck, is actually a 3-ton truck. It weighs about 6,200 pounds. Now, if you get hit by a 6,200-pound truck, what do you suppose is going to happen to you?
Oh, my. I do not want to imagine that, no.
Yeah, it's a very significant and serious safety issue. They're putting out these EVs that are much heavier by a significant amount than non-electric cars, in which by default, by the nature of physics, present more of a threat to the people who are going to be hit by them. And that's going to manifest in the form of damage to the vehicle and physical damage to the people in the cars. So there's that aspect of it. And then there is the fire aspect of it too, which is a significant one that has been constantly underplayed by the mainstream media, just like, oh, we don't know anything about myocarditis with regard to the vaccines. Oh, nothing to see here, right? But the inherent problem with these lithium-ion batteries is that they are, by the nature of the chemistry, they are vulnerable to what's called thermal runaway, which is a short circuit internally. And most people, when they hear about an electric car battery, they think of a single unitary battery. In fact, the battery is composed of thousands of individual cells. And all it takes is for one of those cells to short circuit. And if it does, what happens is spontaneous combustion. Mm-hmm. Gasoline requires a spark. And also, usually the gas itself has to be almost in a vapor form before it will burn. That's why it's pretty hard to get a gas fire going. You get into an accident, even if the gas tank is punctured and the gas is leaking onto the ground, unless there's a spark, a flame, it probably won't catch fire. Not so with electric cars. You hit one of those things and the fire risk is greatly increased. And it's also increased if the thing is parked. Number of fires have happened when the car is just parked and sitting there, or when it's hooked up to a charger, because again, you're dealing with very high voltage electricity. At a fast charger, 400 to 800 volts. And it doesn't take much for that short circuit to happen. And then you've got this extremely fast burning chemical fire that's very, very difficult to put out. Even when it's put out, it sometimes will spontaneously start all over again. And it's why when an electric car burns up, some of the salvage yards have what looks like a gigantic dumpster, and they put the EV into this dumpster and fill it with water to prevent the thing from catching fire again.
Wow. But Eric, if you look at the trend, sales of EVs have exploded over the past decade, and the forecasts look rather bright. But still, in 2021, EVs only accounted for roughly 2% of all new cars sold. How do you interpret these numbers?
Well, it's an inherently limited market. We get back to the issue of cost. There's a reason why you don't see most people driving around in a BMW, a Mercedes, a Lexus, or an Audi. Reason for that is that they're luxury vehicles and they are luxury priced vehicles. And for the most part, EVs are priced similarly. So whether you like an electric car, whether you think it's a good idea or not, the bottom line is most people, the majority of people, cannot afford to buy a vehicle in that price range. So I think we're approaching a market saturation point with these electric vehicles, meaning that the number of people who like an EV and who are in a position to buy an EV is reaching the point at which, that's all the people who could do it. They're not going to be able to build that out farther because, EVs are not like a Toyota Corolla or a Honda Civic that are within the grasp of the average person. To put it in some context, I think the figure is that for the typical two-earner couple in this country, their total annual income is about $67,000. So how does a couple that makes $60,000 a year afford a $50,000 EV, let alone a $75,000 EV?
But considering all of that unscientific reasoning behind the policies, considering that most people cannot really afford any of that, and then there are ethical issues that we discussed, how do you explain the global push to promote them? Why do you think the world's largest economies are on board with this agenda?
Well, it's not the economies, really. It's the governments that are pushing
governments, all right,
via mandates. It's as simple as that. The government.
I stand corrected. Yeah.
Yeah. The governments are saying that after a certain date, 2030, 2035, whatever it is, the only vehicles that you will be permitted to sell, as in California, for example, are what they call zero emissions. And again, this is kind of a dodge. They use that term, zero emissions. And the only vehicles that qualify, that meet that standard, are electric vehicles. So, you tell a company that's in the business of making cars, you won't be able to sell anything except this kind of car by such and such a date. Well, what do you think is going to happen? They're going to stop building the cars they can't sell and start building the cars that they're allowed to sell. And then I don't know if they've kind of answered the question that's begged there, which is, well, okay, we can build them, but if people can't afford them, how are we going to be able to sell them?
But what about the governments? why are they so aggressively pushing this green agenda, switching from the gasoline cars to electric cars? Do they really believe what they are preaching? Do they really believe that it is such a major pollutant that it needs to be eliminated completely?
I believe that the useful idiots believe that, but I believe the people who are manipulating the useful idiots do not believe it. I think the goal here ultimately is not to replace the existing car fleet with electric vehicles. It's to get people, by and large, out of vehicles. The elites, if you want to use that term, the people at the apex of the pyramid, do not like the idea of the average person, you and I, being able to go wherever we want to go, whenever we feel like going, without being controlled. They want control. You control a population in several ways, and one of the key ways is by controlling freedom of movement. Electric cars will help them do that.
When it comes to electric vehicles, let the buyer beware. We'll see you back after these messages.
I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. I mean, whoa. Who knows what would come out of that?
Just imagine if we have a constitutional convention, the number of people who will be unhappy and the number of people who say the results are not valid, and then they'll just ignore the entire Constitution.
What we need are just more people that would read the one we have.
It isn't the Constitution that's the problem. It is the people who ignore the Constitution that usurp power and abuse the constitutional power that they ostensibly have.
If you can't enforce an existing piece of paper, how are you going to enforce a piece of paper that has a little more writing to it? In other words, it's been amended.
It's up to us to hold our elected officials accountable.
What can you do to elect good representatives and senators in your state legislature who understand the Constitution and are willing to take a stand?
As a lumberjack, I've been cutting wood for decades. My job is pretty straightforward. I see the wood, I chop the wood. My axe goes through every time. You remember when everyone bought all the toilet paper? And they wanted me to wear these things? And someone invested a lot of money into this stuff. They say I'm part of a global plan. I don't think so. It's too hot, it's too cold. You know what? The weather changes. We even hear crazy ideas on how kids should learn.
Here's the news, Dad.
Is it, son? Is it?
What about this one, Dad?
Nope. It's hard to tell what's real and what's fake these days. There's just too much baloney out there. At the New American, they cut through the baloney and give me the truth.
Visit thenewamerican.com and subscribe to get 50% off the cover price. And if you want an even better deal, use the promo code 10OFFSUB. Again, that's 10OFFSUB for more than 50% off.
Welcome back to the New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. You know, everybody's already talking about the 2024 presidential election, but is that what we should really be focusing on? Joining me now for a roundtable discussion on this topic from our studio in Appleton, Wisconsin, is Mr. Gary Benoit, the chief editor of the New American Magazine. And Gary, I will let you introduce your co-panelists.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And to my left, we have Paul Dragu, who is communications director for the John Birch Society. And to my right, we have Steve Bonta, who is the executive senior editor for the New American Magazine. So, gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Gary. So, yeah, as you observe, Rebecca, there certainly is a lot of talk about presidential politics. And I believe the talk is to such an extent that one might assume that basically all the powers, or most of the powers, are possessed by the president. But actually, when you look at the U.S. Constitution that defines the powers for the executive government, you see something very, very different than that. So, Steve, what do you have to say about that?
You know, the founders, when they set up the American Republic, they tried to do something that really had almost never been attempted before, even by previous Republican-style governments. And that is to create an executive branch that was not the most important, like the seat of power, okay? Now, the Romans tried that, and it lasted for a while. And their solution was that they divided the executive into two co-equal people, the two consuls, who had to be re-elected every year. So a consulate, meaning the period in which a particular consul was in power, was only 1 year. And they also required them to lead the Roman troops into battle whenever there was a war. So they adopted all these expedients to try to limit the power of the executive branch. They understood from having studied what had happened with the tyrants in Greece and so forth, the danger of having executive at the center of government. And they still ended up with an empire. Okay, so in the American founding, the Constitution in its original form, one of the features that is often ignored was that under the original Constitution, the vice president was the guy who got the second, who came in second in the Electoral College voting. And the result was, and this was very much by design, was a split or divided executive. So that if the system were in place today, we would have wound up with Hillary Clinton as vice president in 2016, for example, which might seem very unsavory, but it certainly would have had the effect of curtailing the power of the executive still further. What happened was, one of the first things Americans decided to do was, well, we just can't have this. We've got to have a more, the term that Alexander Hamilton liked to use was a more energetic executive. And so in 1804, less than a generation after the Constitution was ratified, it was amended for the 12th time. And the 12th Amendment gave us the system that we have now, which essentially allows the presidential candidate to pick a vice presidential running mate. And the result is more concentration of power in one individual. So I think, and one other thing that I wanted to point out in the early going is that the way power works, it's much more efficiently wielded by a small number of people or even an individual, because a small number of people can plan, can conceal, can dissemble, can create unifying symbols much more efficiently than a large disorderly assembly or legislature or something like that. So there's always been this natural tendency for power to migrate to an oligarchic few, no matter what the form of government. And this is one of the challenges we have in the United States. Now, that said, the Constitution still, even looking at it cursorily, Article 1, which spells out the power of the executive branch, is by far the longest article in the Constitution. Conservatively speaking, the powers delegated to the Congress are 20, 22, probably as many as 30 or 40, depending on how you count. So it goes on and on. Article 2, by contrast, which is not even the first article, I think also by design, which spells out the power of the executive, is very short, and the enumerated powers assigned to the executive branch are like 4 or 5 at most.
You mentioned the whole point, wasn't that the point was to not have power so concentrated? That's why obviously we have these 3 branches of government, but I think of Obama back in the day when he said, I have a pen and a phone, and a lot of these guys forget that. But they'll use the excuse, and I believe Obama did, and we always hear this excuse that the reason they do what they do, they issue all these executive orders and they do all these take action and take the lead, is because government is inefficient. But isn't it supposed to be inefficient? Like, that's the goal, right? Well, they're not supposed to get a whole lot done.
Right. If you look at efficiency, if that is the objective, efficiency in government, 100% efficiency, what could be more efficient than one-man rule?
Right.
A dictator can just do whatever he wants. How can he be more efficient than that? But of course, we don't want efficiency in government so much as we want freedom.
Right, right. So we don't want an efficient government.
Right.
It depends what you mean by we, because unfortunately, a lot of people over the generations since the founding didn't think this through. And there's a deep-seated impulse in human beings to worship an authority figure, which is why we advocate so strongly for the importance of religion, because religion serves as the substitute. I mean, it's the substitute for worship of kings and emperors and so forth. If you worship God first and foremost, then you'll be less inclined to this sort of idolatrous, enshrinement of a single authority. But even so, little by little, it's crept into our body politic. And so today, de facto, if not de jure, the executive branch is certainly by far and away the most powerful branch of our government in terms of the actual powers that it exercises over, however illegitimately, in constitutional terms. The president plus the military that he wields more or less at whim now, since we've sort of just gotten away with congressional war power, control, and of course
the intelligence agencies.
All the entire regulatory branch, including the IRS that we're all worried about now because April is approaching fast. All that's part of the executive branch.
But let's suppose, Steve, that we were to get back to the Constitution and actually follow that document.
Hey, I have a question, though, regarding that. If we were to get back, would it be constitutional for a president to issue executive orders dismantling every unconstitutional agency, federal agency that exists? Would that be constitutional?
In my opinion, yes, because the president is the boss of the executive corporation, as it were.
Right.
I should be careful how I use that word, but it's like a corporation in the sense that he can do that. But of course, in reality, if he tried to do that, Congress and all of the legions of the special interest groups whose livelihood depends on the perpetuation of all these alphabet soup agencies and their minions would immediately try to get the president impeached or, barring that, do something.
Right.
But sure, de jure, certainly, he could fire anyone at his pleasure, from the vice president on down to the lowliest, tax collecting agent within the executive branch.
But if we were to get back to the Constitution, though, the president would be doing very little. Basically, what he would be doing is executing the laws of the United States. And if that were the case, how much importance would the American people assign to the president? Or for that matter, how much importance would the American people assign to the federal government if the entire federal government, not just the executive, but if the legislative and the judicial were also put back into their constitutional cage?
Well, I mean, these are hypotheticals. The thing is, first of all, if the president ever tried to do what we were talking about just now, he would be accused of being a dictator. I mean, Donald Trump actually tried to do that to a certain degree by issuing a directive saying, for every new regulation, you got to cut 2 out and that kind of thing. And this was one of the things that was indicative of his latent fascism, fascistic tendencies. See, people have no idea about what big government really is, what dictatorship really means, right? Now, de jure, first of all, I mean, the electoral process, this is something we talk about a lot in the John Birch Society that people should bear in mind as we approach the 2024 elections, and that is, that we are encouraged to focus all of our energies on who's going to be the next president, right? When in point of fact, as we're seeing now with this new 218th Congress, considerable power, and certainly constitutionally, the lion's share of power is wielded, at least de jure, on paper, by the legislative branch. And if we focus on that, that's not to say ignore who's going to be in the Oval Office, but the reality is that single race, as we've seen very clearly in 2020, is easily controlled and corrupted by the powers that be. It's much harder for them to do that for 435, congressional races, right? And even harder legislatively at the state level, all the different state legislatures and so forth and so on. The main issue is that for change to really be affected by the legislature, you have to there has to really, really be a strong consensus, because it's hard for several hundred people to get together and say, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to accomplish. Relatively easy for a president and a small cabal of insiders around him to execute an agenda.
But the bottom line is, if we get back to the Constitution, Congress becomes far more important, and I think the American people naturally would begin looking more at Congress.
Absolutely.
But I think we're now out of time.
We are out of time, gentlemen, but thank you so much for the insights. We'll see everybody back on the other side of this break.
Hi, I'm Alan Keyes. I'm the host of IMTV's daily talk show about news and events in America. And I want to say a good word for the New American magazine. Not only because Alex Newman has joined us as somebody who is periodically hosting a show, but because New American magazine represents a alternative media that is willing to tell people the truth. With so much fake news spreading about, and the fact that right now this country's in an existential crisis, we remember who we are and where we come from and what our principles are, or we die. Reading New American magazine can keep you up to the minute on the issues that are challenging us as a people and on which that survival hangs. You can check it out and subscribe at www.thenewamerican.com.
All right, parents, listen up. We've all seen the countless examples of how radical leftists have been destroying American schools. It's no longer just about the terrible math and reading levels. Now radical left teachers birthed from liberal universities are forcing gender indoctrination in kindergarten. They're teaching lessons on white guilt.
Freedom Project Academy has perfected live online learning over the course of a decade. I get a ton of great feedback about this program, a ton.
They're built on Judeo-Christian values, a classical curriculum. What does that mean? It means they're taught, your children are taught the way that the founding generations of the country. My own son Noah did Freedom Project Academy for several years when he was younger.
The more we tell our friends about these things, the more people will get on board, and I believe that we can be the catalyst to some real change.
We must save the West. Our way of life and our culture is under attack, and because of patriots like you and your project, I have optimism for the future.
Welcome to the New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. We've had reason to celebrate since last June when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, removing federal protections for abortion and handing those decisions back to the states. However, we still have a battle on our hands at the state level. Pro-lifers in North Carolina recently held a pro-life march in Wilmington, and the New American's Mitchell Shaw attended. He's joining me today to discuss the experience and the situation in his home state. Mitch, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to see you. So tell me first about the march. Was there a celebratory feel to the march because of what happened last year?
Well, there was, and you kind of have to understand Wilmington, North Carolina. If you've never been here, it's really hard to kind of get it. It's the biggest small town I've ever lived in. A population, I think the city is about 100,000, or at least maybe the metropolitan area is about 100,000. So it's not a city in any real sense of the word. It really feels like a small town. But we do have the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, UNCW. So, it is a college town, a university town, but it's largely probably a good mix, largely conservative. So, there were a little over 100 people that gathered at this. It could have been advertised better, but about a little over 100 people attended the event. There were a series of speeches, and there was a march, of course, around what used to be Hugh McCrae Park, but is now known as Longleaf Park. And yeah, it was very celebratory. There was, people kind of laughing, but there were somber moments too, where, we were facing the fact that overturning Roe v. Wade is not the end of abortion, though the left would have us believe that. Right. And one sort of common theme amongst the people I talked to was that there's still a lot of work to be done. Sure. Rhino Republicans have been able to use the cover of Roe for 50 years to say things like, oh, I wish we could do more about abortion in this state, or I wish we could do more about abortion in that state. But Roe is the law of the land, and now their cover is gone. They don't have the cover of Roe anymore. And so, right here in North Carolina, we've got Republicans that have said they're okay with abortion up to 20 weeks. And they don't have Roe to hide behind. So that's becoming obvious to North Carolinians.
And that's the case in North Carolina, right? North Carolina protects unborn life only based on gestational age, correct?
So yeah, in North Carolina, a woman can have an abortion for any reason up to 20 weeks. She doesn't need to give a reason, just that she wants an abortion. After 20 weeks, it's for, quote, the life and health of the mother. So, really mental aggravation could even come into play. I'm really super stressed that I'm pregnant might be enough of a reason for an abortion. And we've got these so-called Republican politicians and policymakers in North Carolina that have had to come out in the open in the post-Roe world without the cover of Roe and admit, yeah, I'm really kind of okay with that. And a lot of the sentiment that I was getting from the folks that I spoke with is it's time to do something about that. North Carolina needs to be a pro-life state. A couple of folks I talked to even favored the idea of a constitutional amendment for personhood to begin at conception, which would then, of course, ban all abortion across the country. Because unborn persons are persons and are due all of the protections of persons.
Right. But would you support that, knowing that they could come back and make personhood begin at 20 weeks of conception.
Yeah, it would make me really nervous because I think the lesson we learned from the Defense of Marriage Act was that you can define marriage however you want to, and then define it differently again later.
Right.
Yeah, no, I don't. I would not probably. I would support it, but I would think that there needs to be a better way, and each state needs to still have the ability to ban abortion within the state, so that if that changes later, the state could still ban abortion.
Sure, and that's obviously the problem with putting it at the federal level, is the federal government can usurp the states' rights to make those decisions for themselves. So do you feel that is kind of the general consensus among pro-lifers in North Carolina, or are they favoring something at the federal level like that?
No, I would say that the general consensus that I gathered from the folks that I talked to, if there is a general consensus, is that there is still a lot of work to be done, and that the place to start is here in North Carolina. And then Georgians, of course, need to start in Georgia, and Alabamians need to start in Alabama, and on and on and on. That there's a lot of work to be done. This was the common theme. It kind of, St. Augustine, of course, he was addressing a separate topic. But he said we should pray as if it all depends upon God, and work as if it all depends upon us. And that was, if there was a general consensus, that's what I gathered. These were faithful Christian people, mostly Catholic, but not all Catholic folks at this. And, what I gathered was, the idea of faith without works being dead. We need to keep praying, but we need to be praying while we work.
You got some great video for us that we're showing here. Who were some of the speakers?
So I'll talk about one mother and daughter in particular. Mother and daughter, I think the daughter is 24 years old. Her name is Rachel. The mom's name slips my mind. I apologize. She was told when she was pregnant that her daughter would not survive, and that if she did survive, she would have no quality of life. Again, whatever that means. And almost every doctor they talked to, every doctor in the beginning told them to abort. And in fact, at one point, they had another doctor ask that doctor, are you not going to support their decision to keep this child and see where they can go forward with this? And that doctor replied, the only test I will offer them is an autopsy. And she chose, of course, to keep her daughter. And when her daughter was born, she was largely completely healthy. I met this woman. She's 24 years old. She's articulate. She's intelligent. But that's not even the point. The point that the mother and the daughter both made was that, so what? What if she had only lived 6 minutes outside the womb? That's 6 minutes, and it's a life, and it matters. A life made in the image of God, a human person, matters. And so their story was, of course, very moving. And then there was another mother and daughter there. The mother was 15 years old when she learned that she was pregnant. And she had even some family members encourage her to abort. But her brother said, oh, you can't abort. It's already a baby. Her daughter was there. She's 13 or 14 years old. They read a letter that young woman wrote to her mother last Mother's Day that was just very, very moving. These were the types of speakers that they had, along with a doctor who heads, I think, North Carolina Right to Life, who spoke about the genetics of life, the biology of life, and how life absolutely begins at conception, laying down medical facts in layman's terms that everyone was able to understand. It really was. It was a fantastic event, and they'll be doing this again and again. And they all expect it to grow as they continue to move forward in the post-Roe world.
Amazing stories. Mitchell, we are out of time. I wish we could talk more about this, but thank you so much for your time and for sharing your video with us. And we will see everyone back tomorrow for the New American TV. Thanks for joining us.